Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the 2024 W.G. Sebald Lecture, presented by the British Centre for Literary Translation in association with the British Library. Welcome to all of you here in the Piggott Theatre at the British Library Knowledge Centre in London, and welcome too to all those joining us online for this hybrid event. My name is Duncan Large, and I'm the Executive Director of BCLT, which is a research centre within the Faculty of Arts and Humanities at the University of East Anglia in Norwich. This year marks the 30th anniversary of an annual public lecture series which began life as the St. Jerome Lecture on Literary Translation and was first given in April 1994 by George Steiner in the Sainsbury Centre for the Visual Arts at UEA. The series was conceived by my predecessor, the founding director of the British Centre for Literary Translation and renowned German language writer, W.G. Max Sebald. After Sebald's untimely death, the lecture was then renamed in his honour in 2003. It's been hosted by the British Library since 2014, although the last 4 editions were online only, so we're delighted to be back in person and returning to London for the first time post-COVID. There have been many illustrious Sebald lecturers over the last 30 years. Over the last decade, these lectures have been recorded and can be enjoyed again on the BCLT's YouTube channel, along with today's lecture in the fullness of time. It's an honour and a privilege to introduce tonight's speaker, one of our foremost public intellectuals. We're delighted that in this 30th anniversary year, the Sebald Lecture will be given by Rowan Williams. After studying for a DPhil on the Russian Orthodox theologian Vladimir Lossky, Dr. Williams spent his early career as an academic theologian at the universities of Cambridge and Oxford, culminating in his appointment as Lady Margaret Professor of Divinity and Canon of Christ Church, Oxford, in 1986. He was elected Bishop of Monmouth in 1991, Archbishop of Wales in 1999, and from 2002 he served for a decade as the 104th Archbishop of Canterbury. On stepping down in 2012, he was elevated to the peerage as Baron Williams of Oystermouth. In 2013, he was elected 35th Master of Magdalen College, Cambridge, from which he retired in 2020. From 2016 to 20, he also served as MacDonald Professor of Christian Theology at St. Mellitus College, the largest ministerial training college in the Church of England. And he currently holds the position of Honorary Professor of Contemporary Christian Thought at the University of Cambridge. Rowan Williams has published on a very wide range of theological, historical, and political themes. Of particular relevance to this evening's lecture is the fact that he is also a noted poet and translator of poetry. His play Shakeshaft was performed in the city of his birth, Swansea, in the Shakespeare Quartercentenary year of 2016. Patron of the T.S. Eliot Society and the Wilfred Owen Association, he's published several poetry collections of his own. His collection, The Poems of Rowan Williams, published by Perpetua Press, was longlisted for the Wales Book of the Year Award in 2004, and his collected poems were published by Carcanet in 2021. Among his many accolades, he was elected a Fellow of the British Academy in 1990, Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature in 2003, and Fellow of the Learned Society of Wales in 2010. The jury is out on exactly how many languages Rowan Williams is conversant with. In a 2015 interview with Paul Kay of the European Commission's Directorate General for Translation, he admitted to just the 8 in addition to English and Welsh. But some sources claim a total figure of up to a dozen. His first book was a translation from French. He has also co-translated a multi-volume theological work from German and poetry from German, Russian, and Welsh, including, most recently, the Book of Taliesin, co-translated with Gwyneth Lewis for Penguin Classics. All of which makes Rowan Williams superbly well qualified to give this year's Sebald lecture on literary translation, and we were thrilled when he accepted our invitation. After the lecture, there will be a question and answer session. Then at the end of the evening, you're invited to stay on and enjoy the cash bar in the foyer, where several of Rowan Williams' books are available for purchase, and he's kindly agreed to hold a brief signing session. For now, though, can I invite you to join with me in welcoming our Sebald lecturer for 2024, Rowan Williams.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for being here. Duncan, thank you very much indeed for your generous introduction. It's an immense honour and delight to be asked to give this lecture on a subject which has fascinated me for as long as I can remember. And what I'd like to do this evening in this presentation is to offer some general remarks about the nature of translation to begin with, and then to move into some specific reflections on the nature of poetic translation, with, I hope, a few worked examples to discuss. But I want to begin with those general issues because I don't think we can begin to understand the particular pressures on poetic translation without identifying one or two of the key themes that make translation a complex, seductively fascinating, obsessionally involving activity. In anything other than the mere conveyance of basic information, we're up against issues that take us well beyond simple lexical equivalence between languages, the sort of thing you can get just from looking in a dictionary. And the two areas in which the something more is at work are areas that I'd like to describe as register and code. Every utterance, every text imagines an audience, a public, a listener. And in so doing, it takes for granted that what is uttered, what is written, is something whose meaning and significance depends quite considerably on shared worlds of reference, shared frameworks, and also a tacit understanding of relations between speaker and audience. More of that in a moment. So if we're talking in terms of those two words, register and code, which are not entirely distinct, but I think significantly different, what have we in mind? Register, I would say, is broadly about the set of associations that allow the hearer or reader to find the pitch and the context of what's being said. And when I say pitch, what I have in mind is the capacity to recognize that this is this kind of utterance rather than that. This is the kind of utterance where it's appropriate or not appropriate, say, to use metaphors. This is the kind of utterance where a direct appeal from speaker to hearer, writer to reader, is assumed. This is the kind of utterance where you might expect irony or even parody to be at work. And register, therefore, is bound in with recognizing also what kind of authority is being invoked. If I know what kinds of utterance are legitimate, expected, what kinds of utterance count in this context, if I read the register correctly, I'm recognizing a certain kind of authority in the sense that I know what the writer, the speaker, has, so to speak, the right to expect of me. Authority in a very general sense. But to talk about authority also spills over quite directly into the question of code. These are the elements of the utterance that tells you what's being assumed not only in a linguistic, but also to some extent in a social and relational world. How you place your quotations and where you quote from. What kinds of example are legitimately and regularly expected to be used? Think for a moment of how, in an earlier generation, the use of classical allusion in English oratory established a code of privilege and authority. Think of the way that at least one recent Prime Minister has deployed classical allusion, presumably with some residual atavistic belief that it reinforces moral authority. I open and close brackets with some dots in between. But that use of classical allusion was wonderfully caught by the Roman Catholic writer Ronald Knox in a famous essay of his, where he imagines two former public school men meeting after a long gap outside their London club, and one of them says, "He who fugaces, eh, old boy?" And the other says, "O tempora mores." And the crossing sweeper, passing by, wonders at the privilege, the learning, and the intelligence of these two remarkable men. Or not. But the use and the placing of classical quotation in that context is part of what I mean by code. Code for the kinds of relation that an utterance takes for granted. I began by saying that anything other than a simple transfer of granular and atomized information from one language to another is going to involve raising the question of what you're going to do about these issues of register and code. How are you going to establish in another language what kind of utterance this is? And as we know, there are some translations which apparently ignore questions about register and translate as if this were not the kind of text it actually is. There are texts which are notoriously difficult to place in terms of register. Are they meant to be satirical or not? There are questions about how we recognize, to take the very obvious example, humor or satire, let alone parody. Just to take one example with some professional import for me, it's taken quite a long time for people to realize that the book of Jonah is meant to be funny. It is a satirical portrayal of prophetic rhetoric, and only, I think, intelligibly read against that sort of background. So, those are the general problems, and they are, I think it's fair to say, accentuated when we turn to poetry. Because poetry of all sorts of utterance is the one least open to, least patient of, simple lexical reduction. Translations of poems dependent entirely on looking things up in dictionaries or in certain kinds of rather primitive AI translation machines are not generally very successful. Translation always has to handle this issue of how you convey the kind of text this is, and how you convey some of those assumptions about power and privilege that may be encoded there. And perhaps we can say that a specially successful translation is precisely one that lets you know, sometimes in very unexpected ways, what kind of text you're dealing with, and which brings through the sort of assumptions that are being taken for granted. And this is where, and I'll say more about this in a moment, this is where I think the most successful translations of poetry operate. Without something of this rendering of register and code, the reader of a translated text has no real access to the world of the text, no way of inhabiting the text. Translation will only be a matter of information about a particular level of lexical exchange. And that's not exactly what you look for in a translation. And even somebody like the notoriously puritanical Vladimir Nabokov, writing about translation, will allow that there has to be some place for this. Nabokov's later translations, particularly from Russian, Nabokov's later translations are an attempt to produce a minimal lexical version of the original, on the grounds that, as Nabokov says, it is a rare kind of arrogance of the translator to assume that he or she can insert themselves in between the poetic genius and the reader. Your reader doesn't want to read about you or read your work, but wants to read the original. Unfortunately, they can't read the original, so they depend on the faithful legwork of a translator determined not to introduce themselves into the story. Therefore, minimal lexical attention, word by word, is what you ought to aim for. And Nabokov gives us some instances of this. Here he is translating a very brief text from Russian, line by line, word by word. It's a poem called Russia by, I'm sorry, I haven't got my references lined up properly. I believe it's a Pushkin poem. Russia, one cannot understand her with the mind, nor take her measure with a caliper. Her state and stamp are of a special kind. All one can do is to believe in her. Which is all very well. And if you turn to the Russian, you can see pretty promptly that it is indeed a word-for-word translation. It attempts to do something with the rhyme, which is very commendable, but doesn't get very far with that. And what it does not convey is exactly why this should be the work of a poet worth reading as a poet. And there are even more austere and minimalist versions that Nabokov goes for. More on Nabokov shortly. I thought it appropriate to speak a little bit about him as someone much admired by Sebald. But let's move now to the question of what a successful poetic translation does look or sound like in that connection. And again, honouring the history of this lecture, I turn to George Steiner's anthology of Homer in English and to Christopher Logue's version of part of the Iliad, Book 19. Those of you familiar with Christopher Logue's work on Homer will remember that rather than attempt a translation of the Iliad in conventional terms, Logue recreates episodes from the Iliad using many of the tropes and images of the original, but recasting the tenor of the whole thing very dramatically. This is from Book 19, Achilles setting out to avenge Patroclus. Achilles stands, stretches, turns on his heel, punches the sunlight, bends, then jumps, and lets the world turn fractionally beneath his feet. Noon. In the foothills, melons roll out of their green hidings. Heat. He walks toward the chariot. Greece waits. Over the wells in Troy, mosquitoes hover. Beside the chariot, soothing the perfect horses, watching his driver cinch, shake out the reins, fold, lay them across the rail. Dapple and white the horses are, perfect they are, sneezing to clear their cool black muzzles. He mounts. The chariot's basket dips, the whip fires in between the horses' ears, and as in dreams or at Cape Kennedy, they rise. Slowly, it seems, their chests like royals, yet behind them in a double plume the sand curls up a yellow canopy, is barely dented by their flying hooves and wheels that barely touch the world, and the wind slams shut behind them. I make no secret of the fact that I admire Logue's versions more than I can readily say, but you'll see in that particular rendering, do we call it a translation or not, a very serious effort to convey register. It's this kind of utterance. It's epic poetry, and that is poetry which celebrates the heroic, the extraordinary, the dramatic, the flying hooves of the horses, the chariot creaking and dipping, and just to give us something of the sense of the freshness of a Homeric metaphor in a contemporary reading context, we have that reference to Cape Kennedy. The horses take off like a space rocket. A crass anachronism, perfectly justified, I think, in the context, if you attend to register. About code, there's probably less to say here. There is a certain assumption in this that you know something about epic poetry. You can recognize that what Logue is doing makes sense if you know what epic poetry is meant to do, what it's meant to sound like. To that extent, yes, it is a rendering which carries with it an implied code of authority and expertise. Nonetheless, its language is remarkably simple and direct, and I would say, rashly, works. Even bolder, if I may turn to another more recent example. One moment while I call it up. Some of you will, I hope, be familiar with the renderings of Dante by the American poet Mary Jo Bann. Again, using tactical anachronism, jarring and unexpected reference, something rather like the Cape Kennedy allusion in Logue, to convey, again in register, that this is a text which is expected to be deploying contemporary allusion. The original reader of Dante would have had to cope with a rather vertiginous alternation between profound theology and tabloid polemic about contemporary figures. And also with unexpected, vivid metaphor. So here's a little bit of Mary Jo Bann consciously alluding to a number of contemporary and unexpected correlates. I stopped to have a better look. Virgil, ever patient, stopped too and suggested I should go back a bit if I wanted to. The one being whipped tried to conceal his face by tucking in his chin, but it didn't work. Apologies. I said, "You, staring down at the ground, unless you're wearing a Halloween mask, you must be Venedico Caccianemico. What brings you to this bitter sing-sing?" "I generally don't like to talk about it," he said, "but you sound as if you know what happened in the world, which makes me feel like speaking. I'm the one who tricked my sister Isolabella into allowing the Marquis in so he could have his way with her, whatever other awfulness you may have heard. I'm not the only Bolognese down here weeping. This place is packed with us. There are more down here than live between the two rivers that border Bologna. That area where they're famous for saying whatever instead of simply saying yes. If you doubt how many are down here, just think of the enormous, varied appetites we indulge." Well, Sing Sing there works rather like Cape Kennedy in Logue's version. The colloquialism of the rendering is a powerful reminder that Dante is talking to supposed contemporaries. And there's that lovely little touch of the area where they're famous for saying whatever instead of yes. Once again, I think, although it's an eccentric and daring version, it works quite well in conveying register, and in this case, also code. Dante's authority in the Commedia is the authority of somebody who knows not only his theology, but his contemporary politics and contemporary personnel. And so the way in which this is worked through, I think, echoes just that. And if I may give you just another little bit of experimental translation of Dante, here's the current PN review, which came through my door just yesterday. And to my enormous delight, I found that we had here, remarkably, a little bit of experimental translation of no less than Dante. This by Lorna Goodison. I won't attempt to render the Caribbean dialect theatrically, but you'll, I hope, supply. When I come back to myself after I faint like I dead, after I heard that tragic tale about those two unfortunates that made me feel so sorry for them, I cite up new torments and ones that get tormented wherever I set foot or look in the third circle where I find myself, it cold so till, and sheeting hard rain. And when Dante addresses one of the figures here, he gave out, "The city of Kingston, so full of greed and envy that the damned dem overflow with it, was where I live, when I did spend my life on earth. My name among Kingstonians was Seacow, and the sin of long belly or gluttony draw me here to where I get beat down to slime in this pounding rain. But is not me one, yes, every one go good down here to get the same punishment, for all of we guilty of the long belly offence." Somebody being punished for gluttony, as in the original, but in this case the gluttony turns out to be drug abuse and drug trafficking. It's a step beyond what Mary Jo Bang is doing, not simply feeding elements of contemporary illusion into the translation, but rethinking the actual nature of the sins involved and how you would create, how would you present the personnel of the commedia in terms of Kingston, Jamaica, rather than Florence. So, those are some of the ways in which register can, I think, effectively be addressed. And these translations, adventurous as they are, seem to me, as I've said, to work reasonably convincingly in their context. The risk, of course, is to naturalize the source language, the source text, unduly in the target language, to make it too familiar, and therefore to take away the necessary element of strangeness and difficulty that properly addresses us in all poetry, very especially in poetry from a foreign language. We want a translation because in some sense we want to encounter what we don't know rather than what we do. I would say that of the translations I've just mentioned, Logue, Bang, Goodison, we have a very skillful balance which allows us to retain a sense of the alien coming through there. What we aim at in a good translation is, at the end of the day, a greater alignment with the energy of the original. That's a vague and rather unhelpful summary, but by the energy of the original, I mean the trajectory of its thought, the movement, the internal and vivid relationship of its images, even the music of its language. Which is why a translation which doesn't attend to the movement, the energy, in language and in image, is a translation that will remain mechanical. Which is where, again, I scratch my head a little about some of Nabokov's concerns. But salvaging Nabokov from his undeserved place on the floor, he writes in his little essay on the art of translation of 3 grades of evil in the queer world of verbal transmigration. The first and lesser one comprises obvious errors due to ignorance or misguided knowledge. This is mere human frailty and thus excusable. The next step to hell is taken by the translator who intentionally skips words or passages that he does not bother to understand or that might seem obscure or obscene to vaguely imagined readers. He accepts the blank look that his dictionary gives him without any qualms, or subjects scholarship to primness. He is as ready to know less than the author as he is to think he knows better. The third and worst degree of turpitude is reached when a masterpiece is planished and patted into such a shape, vilely beautified in such a fashion as to conform to the notions and prejudices of a given public. This is a crime to be punished by the stocks, as plagiarists were in the shoe-buckle days. He proceeds to give examples of these three kinds of poetic evil. And it's out of that he, of course, develops his own puritanical view of translation as, first and foremost, a lexical rendering that simply tells you what's there on the page and leaves you to do the heavy lifting, ultimately to learn the language. I think he's put his finger on a number of real issues there, and particularly in that last one, there is indeed a temptation, especially for the translator of poetry who is actually a poet, a temptation to improve, smooth, adjust, and fit an original text into what is taken for granted as plausible or credible poetry in the target language. When that's being done by a genuinely serious poet, you don't mind too much. When it's being done by a less sure hand, you may very well scratch your head, rather. I'm thinking here of Robert Lowell's versions of Baudelaire. If you come at these with a reasonable knowledge of French, there will be moments when you'll be very surprised. On the other hand, Robert Lowell is a real poet, and therefore what emerges may not exactly be Baudelaire, but it's poetry. And it wouldn't be the poetry it is without Baudelaire. So you might be inclined to cut Lowell a bit of slack there. But it's, as Nabokov indicates, a bit of a slippery slope. You better keep your eyes and ears open for how those temptations just might take hold of you and corrupt what's happening. I suspect that many people's juries are still out on Ezra Pound as translator, but perhaps of 20th century poets, Pound is the one who most dramatically illustrates the possibilities and the dangers of this. Some of you may just know a short and brutally uncompromising essay on Pound as translator by Robert Graves, where Graves picks up one of Pound's translations from Latin and demonstrates how, line by line, the body count in terms of straight mistranslation, misreading, active misrepresentation is unacceptably high. It's rather a pity that if you turn to some of Graves's translations, some of the same problems are not wholly absent, but that's another story. So, what's emerging, I think, is that in translating poetry, you have a particularly intensified version of the question that all translators face. How do I convey the world in which this text is operating without footnotes? How do I render the register? How do I maintain the flow of energy? And how, to some extent, without getting too bogged down in this, do I give at least a few hints on the code that might be at work here? And the unusual complexities in a source language around register and code do need to be attended to. So I want to turn to one or two other specific examples, which have a little bit more to do with my own misspent time as a translator of poetry, to see if we can focus these a little bit more closely. As you heard, one of the tasks I undertook in recent years with my dear friend Gwyneth Lewis was translating the Book of Taliesin from medieval Welsh. We both agreed to do this in a fit of enthusiasm, unhampered by any kind of realism about our knowledge of medieval Welsh, which is why it took us 4 years solid. But the Book of Taliesin is itself a fascinating and unusual collection containing material spanning at least 4 centuries and possibly 6. The oldest deposit in the Book of Taliesin is from probably the 9th century in its present form, but it may contain material going back as far as around 600. The latest material in it is probably 13th century. There are a number of tropes and conventions, conventional kinds of poetry that come to focus at different points in the book, but the oldest stratum is heroic poetry, as it's sometimes called. That is poetry from the courts of early medieval West and North Britain, particularly a cluster of poems dealing with what's now southern Scotland, when it was still a Brittonic-speaking area, i.e. Welsh. Or to put it rather more simply, it's from the days when Edinburgh was a Welsh town. Now, rendering that is difficult in many ways because, of course, we have very few correlates in our contemporary setting. We don't, on the whole, in this country, do praise poetry any longer. And that's why in the introduction I mentioned that you could perhaps best read Taliesin by turning your eyes and ears to some of the conventions of Southern Africa, the indigenous poetry of Southern Africa. Some 35 years ago, my wife and I spent some time in Southern Africa working for the church there, and on one occasion were greeted at an event by an Imbongi, a traditional praise singer, who after the meal stepped out into the middle of the hall, extended his arms and began declaiming at the top of his voice a poem in praise of these distinguished and slightly surprised visitors from the United Kingdom. And in fact, there are now translations available of some of the more distinguished productions of those practitioners of the Imbongi style, especially in Xhosa, who wrote down their praise poems for the intended addressees. And that's the footnote which you can't avoid, because we don't, as I say, generally conclude our celebratory dinners with a praise poem of that kind intoned by a traditional trained praise singer who knows not only the words, but the pitch of the words, literally the pitch of the words, and the gestures that must accompany them. Looking at some of these older poems, it's quite clear from the nature of the beat in the line that there are different kinds of physical performance envisaged. The men of Catraeth are up with the sun around their commander, the triumphant cattle thief. It's Irian himself, the far-famed chieftain, who holds kings in check and cuts them down. His passions for war, true lord of the faithful. Misfortune for the men of Pridin's armies. Gwenastrad's a fort fit for warriors' struggle. No shelter to be found in forest or field when they come to battle. Defender of your folk, like waves roaring savagely over the land. A longer line, presumably a more reflective performance, but rather closer to what you might call rap. Here at my rest with the men of Reged, respect and welcome and mead for me to mark his triumph, gifts of fine land to win me wealth, wealth in plenty of glittering gold, gold and good times and glowing esteem, high esteem and gifts to satisfy, gifts from one satisfied when he gives me joy. Slaughtering, cooking, feeding, preparing, feeding, beasts slaughtered before us, and great respect rendered to the world's great poets. Be sure that all bow down to you and bend to your will, so God has granted. Great men snort and groan for fear of your onslaught, stirrer of battle, buttress of the land, always surrounded by trampling horses, horses trampling and beer for drinking. Beer to drink and fine farmsteads, fine adornments showered upon me. Llywelyn's people, Arkel's fighters, both great and small, join with one voice in the song of Taliesin, heartening them all. You are the best, the highest I've heard of. In your great merits I'll sing the praises of all you've done. When I'm old, out of breath, commanded by death, I will still feel delight praising Irian aright. That sounds a lot more lively, and the metre of translation attempts to convey the regular two-beat with a caesura pattern of the original. That I can see much more as a rapidly delivered, perhaps regularly applauded performance in which, of course, the unmistakable demands for reward feature very strongly. I can imagine that Taliesin would have placed a few friends in the hall who might have said, "Here, here," at various points when gold and horses were mentioned. But to get the register of that, I think you have to attend, as I say, not only to those internal clues, the more stately, the more ceremonial celebration of a complex battle just achieved, to the more general postprandial, what should I say, vigor and robustness of the Here at My Rest poem. But beyond that, one has to know something of the praise singer and what praise singing involves. Praise singing involving, yes, the celebration of an individual, but also the celebration of an individual whose well-being is bound up with the well-being of the whole court. That is the elite group who have their focus of meaning in service to their lord. And that service to their lord is expressed in military exploits, military valor, but also in tangible and extravagant generosity. All of that going on in the background of those poems, all of that to do with the challenge here, indeed, both of register and of code. And one of the fascinating things about the Taliesin collection, both those early poems and the later ones, is that another kind of issue of authority surfaces, which I must say I found fascinating in translating these works and slightly unexpected. The later Taliesin, inverted commas, poems, that is, poems associated with the name of Taliesin, but not actually having anything directly to do with the 6th century legendary figure whose name is used for the book, the later poems offer a series of models of the poet establishing authority, mostly by claiming superior knowledge to all the other poets in the room. The characteristic Taliesin poem from that later period is an address to poets, or sometimes to clergy, essentially saying, "You don't know anything, do you? I can tell you," and there will be a string of mysteries connected with legendary or mythological hinterland to what's being said. So, for example, in one of the best known of these poems, The Spoils of Annwn, we have, "I've no words of praise for small men's trailing spirits, who don't know the day when the Lord came to be, at what noonday hour the Master was born, or what creature they guard with its silver head. They don't know how darkness is severed from light. They don't know the course of the wind in its rushing, where the wind will lay waste what land it strikes, how many saints in the sky's vault, how many shrines. But I will praise the Prince, the Lord, the Great One. Let me not be sad. Christ will repay me." The poet establishes authority, and the translator, faced with that claim on authority, finds himself or herself in the strange position of being exactly where Taliesin's rivals and opponents stand. That is, genuinely not knowing what he's talking about very often. That's in itself a salutary exercise. But I read just one other, or part of one other, poem from these later Taliesin pieces. And I choose this partly because it's a poem I'm very fond of, partly because of the question about the title. It's called Bearth Bairth in medieval Welsh, which literally means the portion or region of the bards. And as I struggled with translating this, there was no way eventually in which I was going to resist the temptation to retitle it Poet's Corner, because that is precisely what it's about. And because it is, in a sense, a playful poem, a certain playfulness in the title was one way of capturing register. This is meant to be a satirical poem about the difference between good and bad poetry. And to call it Bearth y Bairth in Welsh, Taliesin is saying, over there is Poet's Corner. That's where the amateurs sit. Now listen to me. a time of sifting, a time of pondering for British poets with pointless verses. My own great strength, my own great standing give dismay to the chorus of poets. I'm a rod for the back of the poets' efforts, the poets' corner where the amateurs sit. 15,000 of them struggling to get it straight. But I'm a seasoned singer of splendid songs, sharp and hard, a shaman, a sage, a skilled artisan, a serpent, a seduction, greedy for nourishment. I'm not struck dumb. I'm not going to stammer. When singers sing what they've learned by heart, no miracle they work will leave me beaten. Contending with me, their fate will be like dressing yourself when you have no hands, like diving in lakes when you know you can't swim. The thundering flood flows on without fear, its high tumult a terror for homesteads, but above the wave, by God's plan, stands a rock. The enemy's refuge is dark and fearful, but that rock is the high king, the judge of all, the Lord who will make us drunk with delight. I'm a cell, I'm a splinter, I'm a shape-shifter, a library of song, a sanctuary for the reader. I love wooded slopes, I love warm shelters. I love real poets who don't buy reputations. I don't love those who live by argument, and mockers of poetry will merit no wealth. But now it's time to take up arms, along with those skilled in the arts of verse, against the cack-handed fiddling of my foes. That sounds like marching without feet to war, like planning to travel without any feet, like gathering nuts where there aren't any trees, like hunting for boars in upland heather, like ordering a raid without uttering a sound, like an army of soldiers with no one in command, like feeding the needy with scrapings of skin, like a badger rootling in the ruins of houses, like catching the air with a farmyard hook, like a light that you show to a man who's blind, like a naked man giving clothes away, like pouring out foam along the seashore, like feeding fish on a diet of milk, like covering a hall with a roof of leaves, like using twigs to trim your cudgel. I'm the bard of the hall. I'm the lad in the chair. I make poets stutter when they speak. And before I'm laid in a comfortless grave, may we all find room in your house, Mary's son. I find that an irresistibly energetic and attractive poem. Part of what you do to establish your authority is to show that nobody else has a right to talk, and poetry that's simply learning by heart, the rote poetry of the amateurs who sit in the poet's corner, is like all those futile activities, that wonderful, exuberant string of metaphors about doing stupid things, like feeding milk to fish. So another kind of approach to authority. And there again, as soon as you've started that, I think register has to be brought through in keeping up that, not quite the rap-like beat of the earlier feasting poem, but something of that insistence which shows you this is a song of satire, derision. It's meant to make people laugh. And it's about code, because it alludes again and again to the capacity of the genuine poet to inhabit what they're writing about or singing about. A cell, a splinter. The true poet, another great theme of the Book of Taliesin, inhabits what they're writing about, and you have to convey that inhabiting. Well, I could go on giving examples, but I'll spare you. Back to the more general issues arising. And I suppose part of what I'm arguing here is that the key point is challenging the shadowy but quite persistent myth that there might be somewhere an ideal translation to be had. Ideal translations would only be thinkable if the only thing translation did were to convey those lexical units from one carrier to another. And that would assume that all cultures are ultimately reducible to one norm, which is certainly a power and code question once again. It's very interesting that the translators of the King James Bible, that text often regarded as inspired in its translation, not only in its original, the translators of the King James Bible, in their preface, say multiple translations are a good thing because they tell you just how much there is in the source text. You're not going to get to the end of this in a hurry. Get used to it. And that aspect of translation, which, as I might put it, alerts you to precisely to the inexhaustibility of the source text, which says this is significant because I have not rendered it adequately. I must keep looking. That, I think, is part of what poetic translation, and any good translation, has to do. Translation, in that sense, is an extended conversation with the original. When you've translated something as you think adequately, you have to go back and speak it, so to speak, to the original and see how it measures up. Have you captured, have you conveyed anything about register and code? Have you got the sense of trajectory, the sense of energy in what's being translated? Have you captured something of a field of resonance? And back to the Dante and Homer translations I mentioned earlier, have you been able somehow to find a contemporary and immediate equivalent for what in the original context would have been startling, perhaps sometimes even shocking, metaphorical moves? And that's the conversational dimension of the work, which affirms the abiding difference of cultures and the need, therefore, for a continuingly self-critical practice of understanding the relation both within and between cultures. That's why somebody like Sarah Maguire, a very distinguished name in the context of poetic translation, can say translating poetry is an aspect of global peacemaking. A very ambitious statement, but one which I have to say I resonate with rather. The abiding difference of cultures and the possibility of conversation between them. All good translation is about that. Poetic translation, perhaps more than most. And so, beginning to wrap up, some of what I'm talking about is the challenge of rendering poetry as poetry. And with all due respect to Nabokov, to render poetry in a minimal, lexically focused way doesn't always give you much sense of why and how it works as poetry. What is it in the original that makes this a poem? What makes it work as a poem? And something has to be done about this. You can't just override it, otherwise, as one or two people have observed, you end up with a great poet from another culture being presented to you in a way which makes it impossible to see why anybody could ever have regarded them as a great poet. Many earlier translations of Pushkin have exactly that effect. And that's partly because Pushkin is a poet who relies very heavily, like most Russian poets, on rhyme and tight metrical form in ways which for the modern reader seldom come across very effectively. And here is a real issue for the translator of poetry into English. Lots of other languages are much better provided with rhymes. What are we going to do about that? Very often when I attempt a translation into rhyming verse from another language, I find I'm stuck with rhymes that sound stale or forced, and also forcing the translation into a kind of jog-trot meter, which simply brings with it all the wrong associations. All kinds of metrical forms in English have unfortunately been wrecked for us by nursery rhymes, hymns, I'm afraid, and McGonagall-esque doggerel. And there are some forms of verse in which it's rather difficult to say anything serious. I hope some of you have come across Wendy Cope's version of T.S. Eliot's Wasteland in Limericks. It begins, "In April one seldom feels cheerful. Dry stones, sun and dust make me fearful. Clairvoyants distress me, commuters depress me. Met Stetson and gave him an earful." All the content of Wasteland 1 is there, but somehow writing in that meter doesn't quite work for the Wasteland. And in a sense, we're often, in translating from a metrically tight original in another language, faced with something like the limerick problem. The form of verse which might correspond on the surface to the form in the original is corrupted for us by association. And that's very hard. And I think it's particularly hard with somebody like Pushkin. It's also an interesting challenge translating from Welsh, which again is quite well supplied with rhymes, like Russian, and like Russian has a wealth of good feminine rhymes, not always easy in English. There isn't very much in common between Welsh and Russian poetry, but one of the things I notice is the feminine rhyme, the use of unstressed syllables at the end of lines in a particular way. And both languages like to play with stress patterns. In Welsh particularly, the alternation of stressed and unstressed syllables is part of the great tradition of classical Welsh poetry. So, very often, in an English translation, you may have to abandon what seems to be the most formally interesting or challenging aspect of the original if you're going to render something that will make it sound like a poem. And that means that as you translate, you have to think not only what makes this a poem in its original setting, but what do I think counts as poetry? What makes me as a translator work, tick, poetically? I want to finish with one particular, very brief case study. Some of what I've said this evening has to do with the way in which the translator seeks to evoke in their translation not the precise set of resonances, the precise detail of the register of the original, but something that has some sort of structural correspondence to it, something that makes you sit up in the way the original might have made people sit up. That's where the Cape Kennedy and Kingston, Jamaica allusions, which are not in Homer or Dante, help us see how Homer and Dante work poetically. But I think there are less dramatic ways in which that comes up. And again, forgive me for turning to something I've worked on myself here, but I think it poses some of the issues that I've been talking about. So what I'll do is just in the last couple of moments share with you a poem in Welsh by Euros Bowen, who was one of the major Welsh language poets of the mid-20th century. Like R.S. Thomas, a priest of the Anglican Church in Wales, in every other respect about as unlike R.S. Thomas as you could imagine. And Euros Bowen made his name with what I think could only be called extravagantly symbolist poems in Welsh. Very ambitious poems in which synesthetic images were freely used, often with structural informality at a very high level. He wrote a poem on Chartres Cathedral, which is a really amazing piece of work. Just to put him in context, I'll read a tiny bit of that. Mi randewais arnyn nhw'n cordio ar fur a cholofn ar y bwy ac ar y llawr. Edrych ar offer cerdd yn y ffenestri, yn las fiolin eu hangerdd, cochliw trwmpedi nwyd, a melynoch yn ffliwtio ar yn ail ethelyn a'r gwynder yn wen yn ei seddau. Yn y man croneg yn hwyll ar y dyfnder, ain gynnwrf yr uchelderau yn y mellt, ac yn y fan tywallodd taron ddiw ochr dirgelwch, either ddallineb y llygaid a byddardod di-ango clyw. I listened to them, striking their chords on the wall, on the columns, on the arches, on the floor. Look at the instruments of music in the windows. The violin blue, the redness of the trumpet's passion, the yellowing of flutes, the harps, the white harps whitening in their place. And then the candles in the deep places quiver. And all that is above turns in the lightning to disturbance and chaos. And then the thunder overflows blackness from the deepest secret place over the blindness of our eyes and the unforgettable deafness of our hearing. Astonishing bit of poetry, I think, in which what I call the synesthetic is made very vivid in that use of nouns as verbs. Anyway, that's Eiros at his most characteristic and I think rather a wonderful poem. This is a shorter, simpler poem, quite a well-known one in Welsh, called The Word, a Gair. I hope you don't mind if I read it in Welsh, but I like reading it in Welsh. Yn y bryderu, wrth liain maen a'n mawl, tra bo erom y torri bara, ar hedd o'r gair am roddi'r gwyn, dros oes a'i nwyd ar syniadau, ac ymarferion am gamwri a fori. Aid o galon y diogelwch, faith gwyn yn ymddiriadaeth gwir, ond I chair a'i fodd yn goch ar fyd. Ar dorri golau o'r dirgelwch, fel nad elo gair gras yn ideoleg ar grist. It's not a poem in the classical Welsh metres, but it uses a lot of the techniques of classical Welsh poetry, the internal alliteration, which you will have noticed, the occasional kind of cross-rhyming of words between lines or within lines. And Eiros himself translated it. And I'm afraid I'm going to use this as an example of how not to translate a poem. In the anxiety, which at the fair linen cloth of our praise is free from care, while for us there is the broken bread and the peace from the word that speaks of the wine given for an age set on the ideas and practices of tomorrow's wrong, let the blessed sustenance come from the heart of security as confidence for men, until it shall glow in the world with the light which breaks forth from the mystery, so that the word of grace shall not be an ideology of Christ. It's a powerful theological poem, among other things. But what's wrong with that? I apologize to the shade of Eiros, whom I loved and revered. The first thing is, the first line, Yn y bryderu, has in it a play, which we would recognize in English, on the word pryderu, which means care in both its English senses, just like Sorge in German. Pryderu and pryder is care in the sense of anxiety, and it's care in the sense of painstaking. Eiros breaks this down by using anxiety in the first line and care in the second line. And you lose that wonderful verbal tension in the first line between the two senses of the word, bryderu, literally the care-free care, or the non-caring care. And the person who first introduced me to Eiros's poetry said, doesn't that remind you of Eliot's teach us to care and not to care, teach us to sit still? And there again, what do you do with a line like, let the blessed sustenance come from the heart of security? Too many abstracts, too many definite articles, at least one too many definite articles there. And glow in the world, well, not quite. Ond I chair a'i fodd yn goch ar fyd. Something about reddening there, and Eiros has lost his own instinct and passion for colour words and how to use them creatively. You need something about redness there, not just glowing. This is the red of the sun rising. And you have quite a problem in capturing that last line, gair gras yn ideoleg ar Christ, so that the word of grace shall not be an ideology of Christ. So I took a deep breath and had another go. Here's the Williams version. In carefree carefulness over the fair linen cloth of our words of praise, while bread is being broken for us and peace shared in the word about wine poured, given for the sake of an age obsessed with planning and performing tomorrow's crimes, from the heart of this sureness of ours, let radiant nourishment stream out to feed the trust of men and women, till its red dawn has its way, breaking light out of the secret place, so that the word of grace never grows and hardens into an ideology of Christ. Attempting, as you see, to do something with the care paradox in the first line, attempting to capture a little bit of the internal rhyme with carefree, carefulness, fair, getting the red dawn in, how to get that in, and really giving up with the last lines. I manage the word of grace never grows and hardens. Grace and grows, yes, all right, that's a shot at it. It's not quite right, but it's better than nothing. And then ideoleg Christ, the ideology of Christ. Well, better in Welsh than in English, but that's what he says. So there we are, finishing with a poem which I think has one or two successes and one or two conspicuous failures. And that's rather how translation works. And as I read you that, part of what I think, reading it, is now I must try that again. And that may be the most important thing that the translator of poetry ever says, because that is what testifies to the significance of what is there in the source language, the importance of those challenges about register and code, and the worthwhileness of going on engaging across the cultures, across the linguistic barriers, and keeping the conversation alive. In other words, going on writing poetry, which seems a good idea. Thank you.
Rowan, thank you so much for a wonderful lecture. I'm sure there will be plenty of questions that are on the tip of our audience's tongue. I'll invite questions just in a moment. I wonder if I could just ask you myself, though, to begin about your collaboration with Gwyneth Lewis. Because your enthusiasm for more experimental translations came through at so many points in your lecture. And I was struck by a moment in the preface to the Taliesin translations where you say that a bolder translator might have done a rap version of this, and yes. you referred to rap a couple of times in your lecture as well. I wonder whether, just practically, how you translated collaboratively, whether you found yourself perhaps egging each other on towards more experimental translation styles, whether you went through many drafts.
Yes, thank you. We carved up the text between us. We did 50% each, basically. First drafts from each one of us, and then we would go through the drafts together to make sure that what emerged was something we could both put our names to. And it was in those conversations that at times some of these issues about register really did come through, where one of us might say to the other, yes, that's all right, but don't you think? And wouldn't we just open a door a bit further if we said that? And Gwyneth, who was a much better poet than I am, was particularly good at that sort of prodding. Yes, that's all right, but, it's not very exciting, is it? And there's more going on than that captures. So that was the toing and froing that went on. But interesting you should ask about the experimental thing. As I think about it, it seems to me that the thing about Homer and Dante is that they've been done quite a lot. And in a way, one of the code things is you sort of expect people to know a bit about more conventional translations so that you can push the boat out. Taliesin has not been done completely for over 100 years. And the existing translations up to this one were either based on a very limited and outdated familiarity with medieval Welsh, the study of which has come on by leaps and bounds since then, or were wedded to an ideal of Celtic poetry, which was all sort of mystical and vague and portentous, and had delivered high-sounding and really rather meaningless versions of some of this stuff. So we wanted to try to present a text that would be okay for the basic reader who just didn't know the stuff. Now, Gwyneth has been working, as well as this, on some new versions of the poetry of Dafydd ap Gwilym, the great 15th century Welsh lyricist. And I remember at the lunch where the two of us were discussing for the first time, trying this experiment, Gwyneth was talking about how she was producing parallel versions, a sort of modern version of Dafydd ap Gwilym as a conventional translation, and alongside it writing how she might have wanted to present it to someone who already had read the first version, but might want to feel their way more deeply into the what I call the energy of it. I'm looking forward to seeing those in print.
Could you perhaps tell us more about how you choose a poet to translate? Because what's striking about your poetry translations is their range, not just languages, but styles, and obviously ranging across such a wide time period as well. How are you attracted to a poet to want to translate them?
Some of it, to be honest, is random. It's chance. Somebody might put in front of me a poet I hadn't come across, and I think, that's really striking. Why isn't this in English, or why isn't it in better English? And I owe a debt there to the late Daniel Weisbord, whose versions of the poetry of Ina Lisnianskaya were my first introduction to Ina's poetry. And I was fascinated by Dan's versions, but thought that there's something that perhaps could be done a bit more energetically with them. And I think they were Nabokov-type versions on the whole. They rendered what was there. I thought, well, maybe you can smooth that out a bit. So I got fascinated by Lisnianskaya and spent quite a bit of time working on a few of those, and of course also wrote a poem for her, and was very delighted when she wrote a poem for me, which appears in one of her last collections, because I think she quite liked the translations. And it's that kind of thing. Somebody might wave something out of my nose. That's with languages that I don't know that well or read very frequently. With Welsh, I suppose I've gone back to rather obvious major figures, with one exception, which is having a go at translating Aled Jones Williams, who was yet another ordained Anglican poet in Wales, though he no longer functions as a priest. And Aled's poetry is, I think, among the most remarkable stuff being written in Welsh at the moment. And it's very, very hard to translate because it's both extremely telegraphic, very brief, and also frequently using North Welsh dialect, which gives it a particular flavour, and for me as a South Welsh speaker and reader, it's slightly hard work. So I struggle, but I struggle because I think it's damn well worthwhile.
You remind me of my own Welsh lessons in Swansea with an instructor who would occasionally say, "Oh, that's very Gog."
Very Gog.
Very, very North Walian. Yeah. Perhaps a final question from me. Thinking about your deep love of Russian poetry, Russian theology. You've also been translated into Russian yourself.
Yes.
And I wonder, you didn't mention that in your lecture, but I wonder if you could say a little more about, or say a little about that experience, and about reading yourself in translation.
Yes. It's a very odd experience indeed, as you can imagine. Because, of course, what you see there is what's always going on in the reader. That is, that someone is choosing from the lexical range of your own poetry and saying, well, that's what matters here, isn't it? And you might want to say, as I sometimes want to say, well, actually, you've left out X, Y, and Z. Well, of course they have. Everybody does. The virtue of that is that sometimes what a translator picks up is something you didn't think was that important, but they have spotted as part of a line of development in the poetry that for them makes it work as a poem, even if you hadn't noticed it. And I love that sense sometimes when you're talking to people about how they read your poetry, that sense that they are reading a poem which is not the one you thought you were writing, but the one you have actually written, whether you knew it or not. And translation, I think, highlights that in a very particular way. You think, so they thought that was how you got from that point to that point. And I hadn't thought of that, but maybe that's what I did, yes. So there's that. Fascinating
So
experience.
you're learning from your
You're
translator.
learning from your translator, yes, absolutely. Yes.
I wonder, perhaps, if we can open up to questions from our audience at this stage. We do have a roving microphone, so please do just raise your hand and I'll call on you. And we have a question at the back there.
Thank you. I really enjoyed that. I have a very specific question which you can discard and a very broad one. You can discard it if it's too specific. But I was intrigued by the reference to shaman in the book of, I'm going to get the name wrong, Taliesin. That's my very specific question. My broader question, and you hinted at this, is do you think that translation can be inspired, like poetry can be inspired? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Two wonderful questions. On the use of the word shaman, that was a deliberate coat trailing, I think. And shaman is a modern word and a modern concept in a way, but many people have said that some of the poems in the Book of Taliesin reflect a kind of shamanistic view of the world. The shaman, the holy man who by fasting and asceticism and dreams ascends to another realm, inhabits the animal world. The shaman dressed in animal skins or bird feathers who inhabits the life form that he depicts. That makes some sense of bits of the Taliesin world, and it's a kind of medieval survival of what seems to be a very archaic mindset. So I thought that was one of those instances where a little bit of judicious anachronism wouldn't come amiss. That the word used in Welsh can just about bear a meaning which has enough Venn diagram overlap for that to work. Inspiration. What a very interesting question that is. I think broadly, yes, is my answer. I think there are translations that capture enough of what I've called the energy of the original, really to participate in how it works. And that can extend from the very, I almost said prosaic, but I mean the very routine or middle-level poetry, where, for example, Marlowe translating Horace, a brilliant beta plus poem in Latin becomes a brilliant beta plus poem in English, and something of the same level of inspiration. It's harder to think of alpha plus originals and alpha plus translations, but I think that there are a few, and given time I might think of some of them. But I've come across enough that make me think, yes, that really does both, both embody and enhance what's there in the original. As I perhaps hinted, it's very seldom that even the most gifted poet can themselves translate with equal facility. And Ayros's English translations, I think, are very strangely flat, given the intensity and kind of polychromatic splendor of the originals. But there are some, and I think somebody like Miłosz, Czesław Miłosz, I would say his own collaboration in some of the English translations of particularly his later work, but not just his later work, I would say they're of a quality comparable to the original as far as I can judge. I know hardly any Polish, so I can't really judge, but they come across in translation as seriously good poems, So I think there is something going on. And don't get me started on biblical translation, but there's something to be said there.
Thank you. Just wait one moment until the microphone reaches you. Thank you.
Thank you for a brilliant and fascinating lecture, but have you translated at all the work of Khlebnikov? And if not, could you recommend a translation? It's rather a specific question. The Russian poet Khlebnikov?
Mm-hmm. I haven't, I'm afraid, and I'm sorry to say I can't help you. Probably Google might, but thank you for asking. No, I haven't. I haven't done very much translation from Russian outside a small number of more or less contemporary, mostly female poets that I know, either personally or on page. There's somebody right at the back in red, I think, and somebody in the middle in the white shirt. Sorry, I'm doing a job.
Thank you, and thank you for the talk. It's really, really been interesting and very funny. I was wondering, going back to how you approach translations, if you aren't deeply familiar with the context of a source text or a source culture, how do you access that world or frame of reference to ensure that you are giving sort of this essence or energy of the translation?
Thank you. Hugely important issue, isn't it? It does mean you can't just translate from a dictionary. You do need the encyclopedia as well, and you also need, I think, a little bit of contextualizing within the literary tradition. You need to read other writers to get a bit of a sense of how things work. It helped me a bit, certainly, translating some of the Russian poets I've mentioned, to be doing more than one at a time and getting a little bit of a sense of how the idiom was working and seeing the issues that were arising. And yes, just keep trying to find out more. Lisnyanskaya, whom I mentioned, it mattered quite a bit to find out a little about her husband's experience, about their experience living in Israel for a while. Lisnyanskaya was Jewish. And then getting a bit of a sense of what it was like becoming a published poet in the later days of the Soviet Union and what difference the post-Soviet era made to writers and what they could say and what they could do. All of those things come in. So you've got homework to do, there's no two ways about it. And the same with the Taliesin poems. If you're scrolling back in time, even more so in a way, you've got to contextualize, you've got to make a few guesses about where there might be allusions or verbal echoes. Yeah, lots to do, lots of listening. Man in the white shirt there, or somebody over here?
Yes. In the middle on the left. Yes.
You mentioned how translation helped you kind of find a link between Welsh and Russian. How, in what other ways has translation made you a better linguist?
That's an interesting one, and a very difficult one. The simplest way of answering, I think, this is especially true with Russian, is you just get a feel of what, it's a stale phrase, you can only call the music of the language. What's the rhythm of this? What is it? What's the beat? What's the actual pulse of this? And I think one way of, now of course you don't then go out and try to start speaking Russian in rhyming quatrains, but you get a better sense of the rhythm of a word, very much so in Russian, where of course you never know where the stress is going to fall. So for me, reading rather more Russian poetry was an enormous help in understanding better how the stress system, the unfathomable stress system of Russian works. And I think, just going back to Welsh for a moment, because Welsh poetry depends such a lot on internal rhyme and assonance and alliteration, that does carry over into spoken Welsh, even colloquial Welsh. in unexpected ways. Again, you get something of the rhythm, something of the pulse. And I like the word pulse here because the French philosopher Jacques Maritain talked about pulsion, pulsion in poetry. And I sort of see what he means. That's what you're trying to feel for at times in translating. And that carries over into how you approach the language as a whole. And it's fascinating too. So many languages have what I think of as one characteristic thing that they're really brilliant at in terms of poetic or metrical structure. So Alexandrines in French, the long line with the caesura, which dominates French drama and classical Welsh and classical French poetry. Alexandrines don't work terribly well in English, but English does the heroic couplet, the Augustan couplet, and that's one of the things that the English language seems particularly good at. Welsh is particularly good at this alternation of masculine and feminine endings, a rhyme syllable which is stressed in one line and unstressed in another. And, well, there are very few examples of that in English. There is a poem by Craig Raine which uses that tactic, interestingly. But that's the particular voice, the particular music of Welsh poetry. So many languages have that thing they're particularly good at, and you sort of know that that's both deeply characteristic of that language, and it's going to be one of the toughest things to get into another language.
Did I hear you murmur under your breath, "Don't get me started on biblical translation"? That was going to be my question. I'm sure you know that as of yesterday, the Catholic Church in England and Wales has introduced a new biblical translation in the liturgy, and there's been a lot of controversy about it. But I would very much like to know your thoughts. I would guess possibly that your position might be that the different literary genres of the different books of the Bible should be lead to different kinds of translations of the different books. So that's one part of the question. Another is this not an area in which it's much more important than in other contexts that the translator should not get in between the source text and the reader? And it's very important to know what it actually says.
Well, having said, don't get me started, I've now been started. So, to the first bit of your question on the difference of genre, broadly speaking, yes. But I think there is a specific difficulty that's posed for scriptural translation in that it's for public use in a very distinctive liturgical setting. And very often I feel we have to encourage people to use more than one translation. It might be appropriate in a liturgical setting to have a slightly blander or slightly more homogeneous version just for the sake of proclamation in public. Meanwhile, we ought to be encouraging people to read more adventurous versions. I love, for example, Mary Phil Corsack's version of Genesis, direct from the Hebrew, which deliberately uses strange and kind of challenging Hebraisms in English and translates things like "behold" as "look!" and makes full use of the complex variation of tenses you might find in the Hebrew. She's also done a brilliant version of St. Mark's Gospel, which you may know as well. Worth looking up, really worth looking up. Now, that, I think, would be quite difficult to do in church, but everybody ought to read that sort of thing to get a sense of how the text works, how its register works in the original. Then as to standing in between, yes, in a sense, absolutely. And yet we still have to bear in mind that there's something here which is bound to entail some judgment on the part of the translator. The translator will try, I think, to let the text be, as any good translator will at some level be doing. But when I think of the actual translators of quite good and successful English versions of Scripture in the last, say, 100 years, there's a very distinctive flavour, rhythm, music to the different versions. Ronald Knox, in his translation from the Vulgate, attempts, mistakenly, an over-homogenized style and a slightly archaizing style. Nicholas King, I think, does a better job with the New Testament than that. Look at the translation of David Bentley Hart recently. Very powerful, very individual, but my goodness, it's David Bentley Hart. So you can't quite get away from it. And I think it's just one of those things where you have to put the health warning on the translator's desk and say, and I change register here, and say, just pray your way through this one, because there's no simple answer.
A question right at the front here.
You talk about Russian and Welsh being very rich in rhymes. Well, Russian is a very highly inflected language.
Exactly.
So will you be rhyming the same part of speech from one line to the next? Yeah. And how does that affect the character of the poetry?
Yeah. I think it gives to the poetry a level of what I call musical coherence, which will be lacking in most translations. I like reading Russian poetry in Russian. I like to get that sense of the tightness of construction that rhyming the same parts of speech will give you. And it's rather wonderful, and it's almost impossible to capture because we're not an inflected language in English. So yes, it does make a difference, I find. It does make a difference. Yeah. Tempted to go for this again. Actually, in the introduction, Nabokov discusses at some length the opening line of one of Pushkin's poems, "Я помню чудное многование," and says that simply means I remember a wonderful moment. And as Nabokov says, well, that's not much use as a translation, and takes you through how it works in the context with the half-heard echoes within the line. Chudnoye has, says Nabokov, a lovely Russian monster, chudo, in it, and a whispered, listen, chu, and the dative ending of a sunbeam, luchu, and many other relations between Russian words. There's a lot going on. And when you're also dealing with, let's say, his voice from another world, голос того света, не узнавая, куда я путь склонила, в какой пределах из мира перешла, а друг я все земное совершила, я тем земле любила и жила. Now you're rhyming parts of speech appropriately, and you get some sense of the tightness of it and the musicality of it, which, because you've got these long rhymes, because of grammatical correspondence, it's not just the boy stood on the burning deck kind of English monosyllabic rhyme, which can sound a little bit abrupt. And it gives you lots of feminine rhymes because of that as well.
We are running out of time, but there's time perhaps for one last question.
Thank you. Can I go back to Irish Bowen and also maybe Walter Williams and ask you? I remember reading 2 small books of Bowen's poems in his own translations about 30 years ago.
Yeah.
And they just didn't come across to me at all. There was somehow not breath in the poem, there was somehow not energy. But hearing you talk and read the translations and reading 1 or 2 other translations, I'm struck by how wonderful it would be to have a book of good translations of his poetry into English. But how would you see the process of that happening when it's not so easy to get books published? And I don't also know, for instance, how many of his poems you've been able to translate and publish already.
It is difficult finding a public for some kinds of translation, which is why I've tended to slip translations into collections of my own under the radar, as it were, because I'm not sure of getting a whole volume full. I've done a handful of Eros. I'd like to do some more. And actually going back to the Chartres poem today made me think I'd like to have a proper go at that sometime. So I'll keep at it as best I can. And I'm glad you think that there is something there, because I really do believe there's something there.
Well, it's very heartening to know that you'll keep at it. Thank you, Stephen, for that last question. Thank you to all of our questioners in the audience this evening. Thank you to our audience here in London, and thank you to our audience online. Thank you above all to our Sebald lecturer, Rowan Williams. Please join me in expressing your appreciation. Thank you.